Hey guys, if you enjoy this kind of long video, please subscribe now. It really helps me upload new videos every day.
The Great Frontier Freeze. Welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your favorite blanket, maybe your weighted one if you have it, and just settle in. Tonight, we're going to drift back to a time when cozy wasn't really a thing. We're headed to the American West in the mid to late 1800s, but we aren't looking at the shootouts or the gold rushes. No, we're looking at the quiet, shivering, slightly absurd ways people tried to stay warm when the prairie turned into a literal icebox. It's a story of heavy wool, questionable architecture, and the sheer human stubbornness required to sleep through a blizzard in a house made of dirt. So, take a deep breath, relax, and let's float into the frozen landscape of the 19th century. So, imagine you've decided to move to the Nebraska Territory in 1870, because why not? The government is giving away land, and you've decided that living in a house made of sod, basically literal bricks of grass and dirt, is a great career move. Now it's January. The wind is howling across the plains with absolutely nothing to stop it between you and the North Pole. In the Wild West, sleep wasn't just a period of rest, it was a survival maneuver. If you were a homesteader, your bedroom was often just a corner of the same single room where you ate, cooked, and probably kept a very confused chicken during a storm. The first thing you'd notice about sleeping in a soddy during winter is the smell. It's an earthy, damp, slightly claustrophobic scent. Since these houses were built into the ground or made of earth, they actually had decent insulation, but they were also perpetually moist. To get ready for bed, you aren't slipping into silk pajamas. No, you're layering. You're wearing your wool long johns, which you probably haven't taken off since October, because why would you? Taking them off means exposing your skin to the air, and in a frontier winter, the air is the enemy. You might add a flannel shirt, a pair of heavy socks, and maybe a nightcap. Not the cute kind from a Christmas card, but a thick, woolly beast of a hat to keep your body heat from escaping through the top of your head. Let's talk about the bed itself. If you were lucky, you had a rope bed. It's exactly what it sounds like, a wooden frame with ropes pulled tight across it. This is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from, because if the rope sagged, you'd end up in a heap on the floor. On top of those ropes, you'd have a mattress tick. Now in the city, this might be filled with feathers, but out here, you're sleeping on dried corn husks or straw. It's crunchy, it's loud. Every time you turn over, it sounds like you're stepping on a bag of potato chips. And of course, straw is the preferred real estate for mites and bedbugs, who are also just trying to stay warm. It's a very crowded, very itchy ecosystem. But the real MVP of the Wild West winter sleep was the quilt. Now we think of quilts as decorative folk art, but back then they were structural engineering. They were heavy. Women would layer scraps of old coats, denim, and wool blankets until the quilt weighed about 15 pounds. When you climbed under 3 or 4 of those, you weren't just sleeping. You were being pinned to the mattress by the weight of history and old trousers. It was effective, though. If you were a cowboy out on the range, things were significantly worse. You didn't have a sod house. You had the sky. A cowboy's bedroll was his most prized possession. It was usually a large piece of heavy canvas called a sugan. Inside, he'd have a few wool blankets. To sleep, he'd fold the canvas over himself to keep the frost off. If it started to snow, that was actually a win. A layer of snow on top of your canvas acted as an extra blanket of insulation. It sounds fake, but it's true. Of course, waking up and shaking off 6 inches of powder just to go find a cow sounds like a special kind of misery. But these were men who thought beans were a gourmet meal, so their standards were low. Back in the soddy, the fire was the heart of the home, but it was a fickle heart. Wood was scarce on the prairies. There were no trees, so what do you burn? Well, you burn buffalo chips or cow chips, which is a polite way of saying dried manure.
because nothing says sweet dreams like the gentle aroma of burning dung wafting over your bed. It burned hot and fast, meaning someone, usually the youngest child or the most unfortunate adult, had to get up in the middle of the night to feed the stove. If the fire went out, the temperature inside would drop to matching the outside within an hour. You'd wake up with your water bucket frozen solid and your breath hanging in the air like a ghostly reminder of your poor life choices. Let's shift our gaze to the more luxurious side of the frontier sleeping, the roadhouse or the hotel in a mining town. If you were traveling, you didn't get a private room. You bought a space. This usually meant a long wooden platform covered in a thin communal mattress. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder with complete strangers. There's a certain irony here. You've traveled to the vast open wilderness for freedom, only to end up spooning a burly prospector named Silas just to keep your toes from falling off. The rule was usually boots off, hats on, and the smell of 20 unwashed men in wool coats huddled around a single potbelly stove was probably enough to knock you unconscious, which I guess counts as sleep. Then there were the warming pans. If you were fancy, or at least had a functional kitchen, you'd take a metal pan with a long handle, fill it with hot coals from the fire, and slide it between the sheets before you got in. It was like a 19th century heating pad, except if you left it in one spot too long, you'd literally set your bed on fire. It was a fine line between toasty and homeless. For the kids, sleep was often a group activity. You'd huddle 3 or 4 to a bed, creating a literal pile of children. The middle spot was the most coveted real estate because you had a human radiator on either side. If you were on the edge, you were basically a sacrificial barrier against the drafty walls. It's strange to think about, isn't it? Today, we complain if the thermostat is set to 68 instead of 70, but back then, staying warm was a full-time job that didn't end when you closed your eyes. You'd drift off to the sound of the wind, the crackle of burning cow chips, and the rustle of straw, knowing that as long as you stayed under that 15-pound quilt, you'd probably see the sunrise.
The architecture of shivers. So we've established that your bed was basically a heavy-duty wool fortress, but let's talk about the house itself for a moment. If you weren't living in a sod house, you were likely in a claim shack. These were essentially tiny wooden boxes built as quickly as possible to prove you were living on the land. They were thin, they were drafty. In fact, they were so poorly insulated that people used to joke you could throw a cat through the cracks in the walls and not hit a single board. To combat this, people became masters of interior design out of pure spite for the wind. They would take old newspapers or pages from the Sears Roebuck catalog and glue them to the walls using a paste made of flour and water. It was the ultimate DIY wallpaper. It didn't just provide a tiny bit of insulation, it gave you something to read while you were huddled in bed. You could drift off to sleep while staring at an advertisement for a magical hair restoration tonic or a newfangled grain thresher. It was a strange, literary way to keep the frost at bay. But even then, the wind would catch the edges of the paper, making a soft click-clack sound all night long, like the house was whispering to itself about how cold it was. Because the floor was often just packed earth or cold timber, the concept of the foot warmer became the most important technology of the era. If you didn't have a metal warming pan, you got creative. The most common method involved the humble brick. You would place a few bricks on top of the wood stove during dinner. Right before bed, you'd wrap those piping hot bricks in pieces of old flannel or a wool sock. You'd then tuck them down at the very bottom of the bed. There was a specific skill to brick management. If you wrapped it too thin, you'd burn your toes. If you wrapped it too thick, the heat wouldn't reach you. And if you moved too much in your sleep, you might kick a 5-pound solid masonry unit across the room, which is a rude way to wake up. But for a few glorious hours, those bricks provided a localized tropical climate for your feet, which was often the only part of your body that wasn't shivering. But what happened when the big one hit? We're talking about the blizzards of 1886 or 1888, storms so massive they turned the world into a white void. During these long winters, sleep became a rhythmic cycle of survival. The snow would drift so high that it would completely cover the windows and eventually the entire house. Now, interestingly, being buried in snow was actually a bit of a relief. Once the house was entombed, the howling wind stopped rattling the door. The snow acted as a giant frozen blanket, muffling the sound and trapping what little heat the stove produced inside. It was silent, an eerie, heavy silence that could last for days. Families would spend nearly 24 hours a day in bed simply because it was the only way to conserve calories. When food was running low, and it often was, you slept to stop feeling hungry. You slept to pass the time until the world thawed. Let's float over to the specific plight of the frontier women, who were the unsung engineers of winter sleep. While the men were worrying about the livestock, the women were managing the hot water bottle precursors. If there weren't enough bricks, they'd use heavy soapstone, or even glass bottles filled with hot water. But glass was risky. If the water cooled down and froze in the middle of the night, the bottle would shatter, leaving you with a bed full of ice and broken glass, which is the opposite of a good night's rest. Then there was the issue of the night air. There was a lingering Victorian belief that cold night air was actually poisonous or caused miasma. So, despite the freezing temperatures, some people would wrap their heads in scarves, leaving only a tiny hole for the nose, looking like a group of very tired mummies. This actually served a practical purpose. It prevented your exhaled breath from frosting over your blankets. If you didn't cover your face, you'd wake up with a literal layer of ice on the top edge of your quilt, created by your own respiration. It's hard to feel like a rugged pioneer when you're accidentally building a glacier on your own chin. And we can't forget the animals. On the truly brutal nights, the line between house and barn blurred. If you had a particularly valuable calf or a sick horse, and you were living in a small cabin, that animal was coming inside. There are countless accounts of families sleeping in one corner of the room while a cow stood shivering in the other. Cows are surprisingly good heaters. They have a high body temperature, but they are not particularly quiet roommates. They huff, they shift, and they have zero respect for your sleep cycle. But in the Wild West, a live cow in your kitchen was better than a dead cow in the field, even if it meant you spent the night listening to bovine digestion. If you were a miner in a place like Bodie or Leadville, sleep was even more precarious. You were likely living in a tent or a shack made of canvas and scrap wood. These men would often sleep in shifts to share the same bed. As soon as one man got up for the morning shift at the mine, another man would slide into the spot he just vacated. It was called hot bedding. It sounds cozy in theory, but in practice, you were sleeping in the damp, sweat-soaked blankets of a stranger who probably hadn't bathed since the previous summer. But again, in a world where the thermometer hit 40 below, warm and gross always beat clean and freezing. As the night wore on in these frontier homes, the fire would inevitably die down. The cow chips would turn to white ash. The house would begin to creak as the wood contracted in the cold. It's a sound that's hard to describe, like a gunshot echoing through the room as a structural beam snaps or shifts under the pressure of the frost. You'd pull the quilts tighter, tuck your nose under the fabric, and wait for the gray light of morning to hit the frost-covered window panes. Staying warm wasn't a luxury. It was a desperate, creative, and often smelly endeavor. It was a time when the simple act of waking up with all 10 toes was considered a successful night. So, as you lay there in your climate-controlled room, maybe take a moment to appreciate your polyester fill comforter and your central heating. They're a lot quieter than a shivering cow and significantly less heavy than a pile of old denim coats.
The internal furnace and the great white silence. So we've covered the heavy quilts and the bricks, but staying warm wasn't just about what you put on your body. It was about what you put in it. In the Wild West, your stomach was essentially a coal engine. If you didn't keep it fueled, your fire would go out. And in a Dakota winter, that was a literal death sentence. Dinner before bed wasn't exactly a light salad. It was a heavy, greasy affair designed to sit in your gut and burn slowly through the night.
We're talking about salt pork, which is basically thick slabs of fat with a little bit of meat attached, fried up until it was bubbling. You'd eat that with hardtack or dense biscuits soaked in gravy made from flour and more fat. The goal was calories, pure, unadulterated energy. If you went to bed hungry, you stayed cold. It's hard to feel romantic about the frontier when you realize that the secret to survival was basically eating enough lard to keep your internal temperature from plummeting. And then, of course, there was the coffee. Frontier coffee was legendary for being strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. They'd boil the grounds over and over until it was thick and bitter, often adding a pinch of salt or an eggshell to settle the grounds. People would drink a cup of this liquid fire right before climbing into their straw mattresses. You'd think the caffeine would keep 'em awake, but when you spent 12 hours shoveling snow and chopping frozen wood, a little caffeine isn't going to stop the exhaustion. It just provided a momentary burst of warmth in the chest before the long, cold night began. Let's float over to the specific madness of the year 1888. The school children's blizzard. This is one of those moments in history where the weather stopped being a nuisance and became a villain. It started as a relatively mild day, which was the trap. People left their homes without their heavy coats. Children went to school in light sweaters. And then the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a matter of hours. The wind picked up the fine, powdery snow until the world didn't just turn white, it turned into a solid wall of ice. During this storm, people couldn't even walk from their house to their barn. People got lost 10 feet from their own front doors. To survive the night, farmers had to tie ropes from their porch to the well or the stable. If you let go of that rope, you were gone. You'd wander into the white void and wouldn't be found until the spring thaw. Inside the houses, the situation was getting desperate. Many families ran out of fuel. Remember, there are no trees on the prairie. When the cow chips ran out, people started looking at their furniture. First went the extra chairs, then the table. There are accounts of families burning their floorboards just to keep the stove going through the night. Imagine lying in bed, listening to the sound of your father chopping up the kitchen table because it's the only thing standing between you and freezing to death. It's a very quiet, very polite kind of desperation. And then there was the hay-burning stove. Some geniuses of the frontier invented a stove specifically designed to burn twisted bundles of hay called cats. You'd spend all day twisting hay into tight knots so they would burn for more than 5 seconds. It was a never-ending job. You'd feed the stove, go to sleep for 20 minutes, wake up, feed it again, and repeat until morning. It wasn't exactly a restful night's sleep. It was more like a part-time job as a stoker on a very cold, stationary steamship. Let's talk about the emotional side of this. Seasonal affective disorder wasn't a thing back then, but cabin fever certainly was. Imagine being trapped in a 12 by 14-foot dirt house with your spouse, 4 children, and a very grumpy dog for 3 weeks straight. The walls are literally closing in because the snow is piled up past the roof. The only light comes from a dim kerosene lamp or the flickering glow of the stove. In this environment, sleep became a psychological escape. People would sleep for 14 hours a day, not because they were tired, but because being awake was too stressful. You'd drift into these long, vivid dreams, maybe dreaming of the green hills of Virginia or the warm streets of New York, only to wake up to the sound of your brother snoring and the sight of frost growing on the inside of the door. The contrast between the dream world and the reality of a frontier winter was enough to make anyone a bit eccentric. Some people dealt with the cold through medicinal means. This usually meant a bottle of whiskey or laudanum, which was essentially opium in a bottle. It was sold in every general store and promised to cure everything from a cough to a broken heart. In reality, it just made you not care that your toes were numb.
A nightcap of whiskey was a common way to dull the senses before diving into the freezing bed. It didn't actually make you warmer. In fact, alcohol thins your blood and makes you lose heat faster, but it made you feel like you was sitting on a beach in the Caribbean, which I suppose was good enough for 1880. As the blizzard raged outside, the great white silence would take over. The snow acted as a sound foam. You couldn't hear the coyotes. You couldn't hear the wind once the house was buried deep enough. It was just the sound of your own heart beating and the occasional thump of a chunk of snow shifting on the roof. If you've ever been in a soundproof room, you know how unsettling that silence can be. On the frontier, it was the sound of isolation. The weirdest part of it all was the morning after. You'd wake up and the house would be pitch black because the windows were under 6 feet of snow. You'd have to tunnel your way out just to see if it was day or night. You'd climb up through the snow, pop your head out, and see a world that looked like the surface of the moon. No fences, no roads, no landmarks, just a vast, undulating sea of white. You'd go back inside, stomp the snow off your boots, and start the process all over again. You'd grind the coffee, fry the salt pork, and start twisting more hay cats for the next night. It was a cycle of endurance that we can barely imagine today. But even in that brutal cold, there was a strange sense of peace. There were no emails, no notifications, no traffic, just the weight of the quilts, the warmth of the person sleeping next to you, and the knowledge that you had survived another night on the edge of the world.
The great thaw and the hygiene of the hidden. So we've made it through the blizzards. The long winter is technically ending, but in the Wild West, spring wasn't exactly a bouquet of daisies. It was more like a slow, soggy disaster. As we drift into this part of our story, imagine the sound of dripping. Constant, rhythmic dripping. It's the sound of the 4 feet of snow on your roof finally deciding it wants to be part of your living room. If you were sleeping in a sod house, this was the most dangerous time of year. While the dirt walls were great for insulation in the winter, they weren't exactly waterproof. As the ground thawed, the soddy would begin to weep. You'd be lying in bed, tucked under those heavy denim quilts, and a slow, muddy drop of water would hit you right on the forehead, because of course it would. People would actually pin umbrellas or sheets of oilcloth on the ceiling above their beds to keep the mud from falling on them while they slept. Imagine that for a second, sleeping under an umbrella inside your own house. It's the kind of ironic inconvenience that would make anyone want to move back to a city. But the pioneers just sighed, adjusted their nightcaps, and went back to sleep. They were a different breed of stubborn. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the smell in the room. We need to talk about winter hygiene, or more accurately, the total lack of it. In the modern world, we take a hot shower to relax before bed. In 1875, in a cabin on the frontier, a hot shower was a physical impossibility. Water was scarce, and heating enough of it to submerge a human body required hours of labor and an ungodly amount of cow chips, so most people simply stopped washing for months. You'd go into hibernation mode around November. You'd put on your heavy wool union suit, those one-piece long johns with the flap in the back, and you basically became one with that garment. It was your second skin. By March, that wool was less of a fabric and more of a historical record of everything you'd eaten and every chore you'd done for the last 90 days. When you climbed into bed with your spouse and children, you weren't just sharing body heat, you were sharing a collective, concentrated aroma of wood smoke, salt pork, unwashed wool, and human sweat. It sounds horrifying to us, but the human brain is a funny thing. It eventually just mutes the smell. After a while, you didn't notice that Great Uncle Silas smelled like a wet goat. You just noticed that he was warm. And in the Wild West, warm was the only personality trait that mattered. As the thaw progressed, the spring cleaning rituals began, and they were intense.
Because the mattresses were filled with straw or corn husks, they had spent the winter becoming a literal playground for vermin. Mice, fleas, and bedbugs loved the warmth of a human bed just as much as the humans did. When the first warm day arrived, the first order of business was burning the bedding. You'd drag those heavy, itchy mattresses outside, rip them open, and dump the old, crushed straw into a pile to be burned. The smell of burning, bug-infested straw was the official scent of spring on the prairie. You'd then wash the fabric tick in a tub of boiling water and lye, which was so harsh it would practically peel the skin off your hands, and then refill it with fresh, crisp straw. That first night sleeping on a fresh mattress without the roommates you'd had all winter was probably the closest thing to a spa day a pioneer would ever experience. Let's float over to the spring sickness. After months of eating nothing but dried meat, flour, and coffee, the human body starts to complain. Scurvy was a real threat. People would get lethargic, their gums would ache, and their sleep would become fitful and restless. The cure was often as bad as the disease. Mothers would dose their families with sulfur and molasses. It was a thick, sludge-like tonic that was supposed to purify the blood after a long winter. It tasted like a volcanic eruption mixed with swamp water. You'd get a giant spoonful of this before bed, and it would sit in your stomach like a lead weight. But miraculously, as the first wild onions and dandelions poked through the melting snow, people would rush out to eat anything green. They'd make mess of greens, boiling weeds just to get some vitamins back into their systems. As the ice on the rivers began to break, the sound was like thunder. If you lived near a creek, the ice jam was the soundtrack to your sleep. Huge chunks of ice would grind against each other, creating a low-frequency vibration that you could feel in your bones through the floorboards. It was a reminder that nature was waking up, and it usually was in a bad mood. Flooding was the next hurdle. If your cabin was built in a low spot, you might wake up to find 2 inches of freezing meltwater swirling around the legs of your bed. There are stories of families stacking their furniture and sleeping on top of their dining tables, the same tables they'd nearly chopped up for firewood a month earlier, just to stay dry. Through all of this, the mud, the smell, the sulfur, and the floods, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The great white silence was replaced by the cacophony of the prairie. Frogs in the melt pools, the return of the meadowlarks, and the constant squelch of boots in the mud. Sleep became shorter. In the winter, you slept because there was nothing else to do. In the spring, you slept because you were exhausted from trying to reclaim your life from the frost. You'd fall into bed, your muscles aching from hauling mud and fixing fences, and you'd sleep with the window cracked just a tiny bit. For the first time in months, the air coming in wasn't a death threat. It was just air. It's a strange irony that we spend so much money today trying to simulate nature in our bedrooms. White noise machines, essential oil diffusers, organic cotton sheets. For the people of the Wild West, nature was something they were trying to keep out of their beds with every fiber of their being. Their white noise was a howling gale. Their essential oil was burning cow manure, and their organic sheets were made of scratchy, unwashed wool. And yet, as they lay there, in the damp, receding cold, listening to the world turn back into a muddy, living thing, they probably felt a sense of victory. They had survived the brutal winter. They had kept their internal furnace burning. And soon the sun would stay up long enough that they wouldn't have to huddle under 15 pounds of quilts just to keep their souls from freezing.
The simmering prairie and the hum of the hoppers. So, we've finally survived the mud, the damp quilts have been hung out on the line, and the smell of wet wool has finally, mercifully, faded into the background. But as the pioneers soon discovered, the Great Plains don't really do moderation. By the time June rolls around, the landscape has stopped being a frozen wasteland and has transformed into a giant, shimmering frying pan. If sleeping in the winter was a battle against the cold, sleeping in the summer was a battle against, well, everything else. The same sod house that kept you warm in January now feels like a damp oven.
Because sod holds moisture, the humidity inside could reach levels that made the air feel like warm soup. You'd lie down on your fresh straw mattress, and within 5 minutes you were sticking to the fabric. In the winter, you wore everything you owned to bed. In the summer, you wore as little as Victorian modesty allowed, which was still way too much clothing for a 95-degree night. Men might strip down to a light linen shirt, while women dealt with layers of cotton shifts. But you couldn't just sleep on top of the covers. Why? Because of the guests. Let's talk about the insects. If there is one thing the Wild West had in abundance, it was things that bite, sting, or just crawl over your face while you're trying to dream. Without window screens, which were a rare luxury, the night air wasn't just air, it was a delivery system for mosquitoes the size of small birds. To cope, people would hang cheesecloth over their beds, creating a sort of makeshift canopy. It helped, but it also cut off the airflow. So you were left with a choice: be eaten alive by bugs in a slight breeze, or slowly steamed to death inside a cheesecloth tent. Most people chose the steam. You'd lie there, perfectly still, listening to the high-pitched whine of a mosquito circling just inches from your ear, praying that the cloth didn't have a single hole in it. And then, of course, there were the grasshoppers. In the mid-1870s, the locust plagues were biblical. We aren't talking about a few bugs in the garden. We're talking about clouds of grasshoppers so thick they blotted out the sun. When they landed, they ate everything. They ate the crops. They ate the wool off the sheep's backs. They even ate the handles off wooden shovels because they liked the salt from the human sweat. Imagine trying to sleep during a locust plague. The sound was like a constant, rhythmic hailstorm, millions of tiny legs and wings tapping against the walls and roof of your house. Click, click, scuttle. They would crawl through the cracks in the door. You'd wake up in the middle of the night to feel something cold and crunchy landing on your cheek. You'd brush it off, only to hear 3 more land on the floor. It wasn't scary exactly. They didn't bite humans, but it was a psychological endurance test. It's hard to achieve a deep, restful REM cycle when you know your house is slowly being consumed by a billion vibrating insects. To catch a breeze, many families moved their beds outside. This was the era of porch sleeping. You'd drag your mattress out onto the grass or the porch, hoping for a puff of wind. You'd look up at a sky so full of stars it looked like spilled milk. It was beautiful, sure, but you were also sharing the yard with coyotes. You'd be drifting off to sleep, only to be jolted awake by a chorus of yips and howls that sounded like they were coming from right under your bed. The coyotes weren't the real problem, though. The real problem was the prairie fire. In the summer, the tall grass became tinder dry. A single spark from a locomotive or a stray lightning strike could start a wall of fire that moved faster than a galloping horse. Because of this, sleep was always light. Farmers would keep a fire break plowed around their houses, a circle of bare dirt, but you still slept with one ear open for the sound of crackling. If the wind changed and you smelled smoke in the middle of the night, you didn't hit a snooze button. You grabbed your family, ran to the cyclone cellar or the middle of the plowed field, and watched your world turn orange. But let's float back to a calmer summer night. One of the strangest ways people tried to stay cool was the wet sheet trick. Before bed, you'd soak a bedsheet in a bucket of well water, wring it out until it was just damp, and then drape it over your body. As the water evaporated in the dry prairie wind, it created a primitive form of air conditioning. For about 20 minutes, it felt like heaven. Then the sheet would reach body temperature, and you'd wake up feeling like a steamed tamale. So you'd get up, dunk the sheet again, and repeat the process until the sun came up. Water management was a recurring theme. In the winter, you worried about water freezing. In the summer, you worried about it disappearing. Wells would run dry, and the water that remained was often alkali, bitter, salty, and warm. Drinking a glass of lukewarm, salty water before bed didn't exactly lead to a refreshed morning. It led to a parched throat and a very grumpy start to the day. And yet, despite the heat, the bugs, the thirst, and the threat of fire, there was a rhythm to these summer nights. The sound of the cicadas provided a natural white noise that could be quite hypnotic if you let it. The smell of the sagebrush and the dry earth, baked by the sun all day, had a clean, toasted aroma that was a welcome relief from the wet goat smell of the winter. Families would sit out on the porch long after dark, not because it was too hot to go inside, but because it was too hot to go inside. They'd tell the same old stories, watch the heat lightning flicker on the horizon, and wait for the temperature to drop that final 5 degrees that made sleep possible. In these moments, the Wild West wasn't about outlaws or gunfights. It was just about a group of people, exhausted by the sun, trying to find a tiny bit of peace in a landscape that never seemed to stop testing them. They'd eventually retreat inside, blow out the kerosene lamp, and settle into their straw beds, listening to the rustle of the wind in the corn and the distant, lonely cry of a whippoorwill. They were surviving, one season at a time, one itchy, humid, star-filled night at a time.
The cowboy's canvas and the rattlesnake lullaby. So we've talked about the families in their sod houses, but what about the men who lived on the move? The cowboys of the late 1800s were essentially professional campers, but without any of the modern gear that makes camping actually fun. For a drover on a 3-month cattle drive from Texas to Kansas, sleep was a luxury that was usually bought in 4-hour increments. When you're a cowboy, your bed is called a sugan. It's a word that sounds cozy, but the reality was anything but. A sugan was a heavy patchwork quilt, often made from scraps of old wool coats and trousers, much like the quilts in the sadis. This was tucked inside a bedroll, a long strip of heavy, waterproofed canvas about 18 feet long. To go to bed, you'd lay the canvas on the ground, place your blankets on one half, crawl in, and then fold the other half of the canvas over your head like a giant, rugged taco. The first thing you'd learn as a greenhorn on the trail is that the ground is never flat. There's always a rock, a root, or a particularly aggressive clump of buffalo grass right under your kidney. But after 16 hours in the saddle, you didn't really care. You'd drop your bedroll anywhere, hopefully not in a dry creek bed that might flash flood, but you were usually too tired to be picky. Your pillow was your saddle. Now, if you've ever looked at a Western saddle, you know it's made of wood and heavy leather. It is not soft. To make it remotely sleepable, you drape your slicker, your yellow oilskin raincoat, over the seat. This didn't make it soft, it just made it slightly less like sleeping on a pile of lumber. The horn of the saddle was always pointing away from your head, because waking up and accidentally impaling your skull on a saddle horn is a very poor way to start a workday. But let's talk about the night guard. On a cattle drive, the cows don't just turn off like a lamp. They're nervous, heavy, and prone to stampeding if a leaf blows the wrong way. So the cowboys slept in shifts. You'd get your first guard shift, second guard shift, or third guard shift. The most coveted was the first guard, because you got to go to sleep afterward and stay asleep until breakfast. The worst was second guard, because you'd just fallen into a deep, delicious sleep when someone would nudge your shoulder and tell you it was your turn to go sit in the dark for 2 hours. The night guard shift was a strange, meditative experience. To keep the cattle calm and to keep yourself awake, you sang. This is where the cowboy crooner stereotype comes from. It wasn't about being a great singer. It was about the steady, low vibration of the human voice. It told the cows that a human was nearby and that everything was okay. You'd circle the herd in the pitch black, humming Old Dan Tucker or the Streets of Laredo, watching the glowing eyes of the cattle and the distant silhouettes of the wolves. When your shift was over, you'd crawl back into your bedroll. But before you did, you had to perform the boots and hat check. In the Wild West, your boots weren't just footwear. They were a 5-star hotel for scorpions and rattlesnakes. A snake looking for warmth would often find its way into a nice dark boot left by the fire. Because of this, cowboys slept with their boots tucked inside the bedroll with them, or they turned them upside down on a couple of sticks. Waking up and sliding your foot into a confused scorpion is a sensation that no amount of frontier whiskey can truly fix. And then there was the rattlesnake myth. There was a common belief that if you laid a rope made of horsehair in a circle around your bedroll, a rattlesnake wouldn't cross it because the hair would tickle its belly. Every cowboy had a hair rope for this purpose. Scientifically, it's total nonsense. A rattlesnake will crawl over a horsehair rope without a second thought. But in the 1880s, that rope was a psychological safety blanket. It was the nightlight of the frontier. If believing in a magic rope helped you sleep while surrounded by predators, then you used the rope. The climate on the trail was its own brand of chaos. If it rained, you didn't have a roof. You just pulled the canvas of your bedroll over your face and hoped you didn't drown. The canvas was supposed to be waterproof, but after a few weeks of dust and sun, it usually leaked. You'd wake up in a puddle with the smell of wet canvas and damp wool filling your lungs. But there was a strange, quiet beauty to it, too. On a clear night in the Panhandle, with no city lights for 500 miles, the sky felt like it was pressing down on you. You'd lie there in your taco bedroll, watching the campfire die down to red embers, listening to the cookie, the camp cook, snoring in the back of the chuck wagon. The chuck wagon was the center of the cowboys' universe. It held the food, the water, and the medicinal whiskey. But more importantly, it held the jockey box, where the cowboys kept their few personal treasures, a letter from home, a photograph of a girl in Missouri, or a harmonica. Before sleep, a cowboy might pull out that harmonica and play a few low, mournful notes. It was the soundtrack of the lonely, a sound that carried across the flat prairie like a sigh. In the morning, there was no alarm clock. There was only Cookie banging a tin pan and shouting something like, "Roll out or roll under," usually around 4 a.m. You'd jump out of your bedroll, shake out your boots carefully, and grab a cup of that six-shooter coffee. Your back ached, your eyes were gritty with dust, and you'd only slept 4 hours. But as you looked at the sun rising over the rim of the world, you'd realize that you were one of the few people who got to see the wilderness in its rawest, quietest form. The cowboy's sleep was a series of naps interrupted by danger, weather, and the whims of a 1,000-pound steer. It was a life of resting rather than sleeping. And yet, many of these men, when they finally retired to a real bed in a house, found that they couldn't sleep. The ceiling felt too close. The air felt too still. They missed the smell of the horse, the weight of the canvas, and the sound of the wind whispering through the sagebrush.
The boomtown, Bedlam, and the canvas cities.
So, we've spent a lot of time in the quiet, the frozen silence of the soddy and the lonely hum of the cattle trail. But now I want you to imagine a different kind of frontier exhaustion. We're drifting into the boomtowns. Whether it was a gold strike in California, a silver rush in Nevada, or a railroad hub in Kansas, these towns didn't grow, they exploded. When you arrived in a town like San Francisco in 1849 or Deadwood in 1876, the first thing you realized was that there was nowhere to sleep. Buildings couldn't be put up fast enough, so the urban frontier was a world of canvas. Entire streets were lined with massive tents, some of them holding hundreds of men. These were called lodging houses, but that's a very generous term for what was essentially a warehouse of misery. In these tent cities, sleep was a commercial commodity, and it was sold in shifts. Because space was so limited, a single bunk might be rented out to 3 different men over a 24-hour period. You'd pay your 2 bits, about 25 cents, and you'd get the bed for 8 hours. As soon as you stood up, the next guy, who had been sitting on a crate waiting for you, would slide right into your warm, damp spot. It was the ultimate hot bedding scenario. There was no changing of the sheets because there were no sheets. You slept on a pile of straw covered in a burlap sack, and you didn't ask questions about who had been there before you. But the real enemy of sleep in a boomtown wasn't the uncomfortable bed, it was the noise. These towns never slept. Saloons were open 24 hours a day. The walls of your hotel were often just thin canvas or uninsulated pine boards. This meant that every piano trill from the honky-tonk next door, every drunken argument in the street, and every gunshot echoed through your bedroom as if it were happening right next to your ear. To survive this, the pioneers of the boomtowns developed a sort of situational deafness.
You learned to sleep through the sound of a bar fight, but you'd wake up instantly at the sound of someone touching your boots. Theft was rampant. If you were lucky enough to have a pair of decent leather boots, you didn't leave them by the bed. You used them as a pillow. You'd tuck your gold pouch or your meager earnings deep inside the toe of your boot, wrap your coat around it, and rest your head on the hard leather. It wasn't comfortable, but it was the only way to ensure you'd still be employed in the morning. Let's talk about the bed cutters. In the more dangerous mining camps, there was a specific type of thief who would wait until the middle of the night, sneak up to the side of a canvas tent, and use a sharp knife to slit the fabric right next to where a man was sleeping. They'd reach through the slit, grab whatever they could, a watch, a belt, or a purse, and vanish into the shadows before the sleeper even realized the cold night air was hitting his face. Because of this, men started sleeping in the middle of the tents, creating a human buffer of the poorest travelers on the edges. It was a literal social hierarchy based on how likely you were to get robbed in your sleep. As these towns became more civilized, we saw the rise of the palace hotels. These were the pride of the West, places like the Maxwell House or the Occidental. They promised luxury, which in 1880 meant you might actually get a room to yourself. But even luxury had its quirks. The beds in these hotels were often stuffed with Spanish moss or seagrass. It was softer than corn husks, sure, but it had a tendency to settle and clump. By the end of a month, the mattress would have a deep valley in the middle. If you were a restless sleeper, you'd spend the whole night trying to climb out of the center of the bed. And then there was the chamber pot. Before modern plumbing, every room had a ceramic pot tucked under the bed. In a crowded hotel with thin walls, the sound of the midnight shuffle as people used these was a constant, unglamorous part of the night. In the morning, the chambermaids, who were often just overworked teenagers or immigrants, would come through to empty them. The smell of a large hotel in the morning was a cocktail of stale cigar smoke, cheap whiskey, and, well, the reality of 500 people living without toilets. It's a detail the Hollywood movies seem to leave out. For the women in these towns, the shopkeepers, the laundresses, and the hurdy-gurdy girls, sleep was even more elusive. They often lived in lean-tos or tiny rooms behind their places of business. A woman sleeping alone in a boomtown was a target, so they became experts in fortifying their bedrooms. They'd wedge chairs under door handles and sleep with derringers, tiny pistols, under their pillows. One account from a woman in Virginia City describes how she tied bells to her doorframe so that even the slightest movement would wake her up. Sleep for her wasn't a time of rest, it was a state of armed vigilance. Let's float over to the railroad workers, the Gandy dancers, who were building the tracks that would eventually kill the Wild West. They lived in outfit cars. These were essentially rolling dormitories, converted boxcars filled with triple-decker bunks. Imagine 30 men in a single wooden boxcar. The heat in the summer was suffocating, and the cold in the winter was biting. But the worst part was the vibration. Because these cars were often parked on sidings near the active tracks, the men would try to sleep while massive steam locomotives thundered past just a few feet away. The whole boxcar would shake, the bunks would rattle, and the soot from the engine's chimney would drift through the cracks in the door, covering the sleeping men in a fine layer of black ash. They'd wake up looking like coal miners with raccoon eyes where their eyelids had been closed. But even in the middle of this industrial noise and urban chaos, people found ways to make it home. You'd see a miner in a tent city who had managed to save a single lace doily from his mother's house back east, pinned to the canvas wall next to his bunk. You'd see a railroad worker who spent his last nickel on a dream pillow stuffed with dried lavender to drown out the smell of the grease and the soot. These little touches were the weighted blankets of the 19th century. They were a way of saying, I am a human being, not just a cog in this machine. As the sun began to rise over the jagged peaks of the Sierras or the dusty streets of Abilene, the boomtown bedlam would shift gears. The saloons would finally quiet down for an hour, the freight wagons would start their rhythmic creak thump on the cobblestones, and the men in the hotbeds would swap places once again. It was a restless, frantic kind of sleep. It lacked the dignity of the prairie and the safety of the Sadi, but it was the heartbeat of the frontier.
It was the sound of a country trying to grow up too fast and staying awake far past its bedtime.
One eye open, the outlaws rest. So, we've looked at the families and the laborers, but let's talk about the people whose sleep was a matter of life and death every single night. If you were a man on the run in the Wild West, someone like Billy the Kid or a member of the younger gang, sleep wasn't a luxury, it was a tactical vulnerability. In the movies, outlaws are always sitting around a roaring campfire, laughing and drinking. In reality, a roaring fire was basically a neon sign that said, "Please arrest or shoot me." When an outlaw bedded down for the night, he didn't look for comfort, he looked for an exit. You wouldn't find these men sleeping in the middle of a flat plain. They sought out rim rock, high, rocky outcroppings where they could see for miles. They'd find a small cut bank or a hidden grove of cedar trees. The goal was to be invisible. The first rule of outlaw sleep was the cold camp. This meant no fire. You'd eat your jerky and hardtack in the dark, shivering in your coat, because smoke could be seen for 10 miles, and the smell of wood smoke carried even further on the wind. You'd sleep in your clothes, boots on, spurs often still jingling, because you might need to be on your horse in approximately 6 seconds if a sentry gave the word. And let's talk about the horses. A cowboy's horse was his partner, but an outlaw's horse was his life insurance policy. They would sleep with the reins literally looped around their wrists or tied to their belts. This had a dual purpose. First, if someone tried to steal the horse, the tug on your arm would wake you instantly. Second, horses have much better hearing than humans. If a posse was approaching, the horse would shift, blow air through its nose, or stomp a hoof. That subtle vibration would travel up the leather reins and wake the sleeper long before the lawmen were in range. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with being a fugitive, a hypervigilance that ruins the brain's ability to actually rest. You drift into a light slumber, but every snap of a dry twig, every hoot of an owl, would send your hand flying to the holster under your head. Most outlaws didn't use saddles as pillows. They used their boots or a rolled-up coat, keeping their six-shooter or their Winchester rifle right against their cheek. It wasn't about being tough. It was about the fact that 5 minutes of sleep was the most they could afford at one time. Then there were the U.S. Marshals and the Pinkerton agents who hunted them. Their sleep was just as miserable, but for different reasons. They had to follow the trail, often riding for 20 hours straight. A lawman's sleep was official, but just as rugged. They often slept in relays. While one man slept, another would sit with a shotgun across his knees, staring into the darkness. If a marshal was lucky enough to be in a town, he didn't sleep in the hotel bed. He slept in the jailhouse. Why? Because the jail was the only building in town with thick stone or brick walls. In a world where regulators or vigilantes might try to break a prisoner out or break in to lynch one, the jail was the safest fortress. A marshal would pull a cot into the office, lock the heavy iron door, and sleep with the keys under his mattress. The sound of a prisoner rattling his chains in the next room was his lullaby. It was a grim, metallic way to spend a night. Let's float over to a specific historical quirk, the sleeplessness of the famous lawmen. Men like Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok were known for their intense, almost ghostly calm. But much of that came from chronic sleep deprivation. When you're constantly looking over your shoulder, your nervous system stays in fight or flight mode. They developed a 1,000-yard stare. Wild Bill, for example, was notoriously paranoid about his back. Even when he was sleeping in a room, he would position his bed so that he could see the door and the window simultaneously. He would often place a chair against the door so it would creak if moved. This wasn't just Old West flavor, it was a survival mechanic. When he was finally killed in Deadwood, he was playing cards with his back to the door, a rare moment where he let his guard down, likely because he was too exhausted to care anymore. But what about the bed cutters we mentioned in the last part? For an outlaw, a bed cutter wasn't just a thief, he was a potential bounty hunter.
There was a constant fear of being sold out by a friend for the reward money. This led to a strange social ritual among gangs. They would sleep in a circle, feet toward the center like the spokes of a wheel. This way, everyone's head was facing outward, watching a different section of the horizon. It was a communal pact of paranoia. If you wanted to kill one man in the gang, you'd have to deal with 5 others waking up at the same time. And we can't forget the night terrors. Many of these men had seen things that the human mind isn't designed to process: bloody skirmishes, Civil War horrors, or the results of a botched robbery. Without the modern understanding of PTSD, they dealt with their ghosts through whiskey. A bottle of rot-gut bourbon was a staple in every outlaw's saddlebag. They'd drink until the world went fuzzy, not because they wanted to party, but because they wanted to stop the dreams. They'd collapse into a stupor, waking up at dawn with a pounding headache and a mouth that felt like it was filled with prairie dust. They'd climb back into the saddle, their eyes red-shot, and do it all over again. Even the most famous outlaws had their breaking points. There's a story about Jesse James once staying at a farmhouse under a fake name. The farmer's wife noticed that even though he was a gentleman, he never took off his gun belt, even when he lay down on the guest bed. He spent the whole night staring at the ceiling, his hand resting on the grip of his Remington. When he left in the morning, he left a gold coin on the pillow, a payment for a rest that he never actually achieved. The outlaw's rest was a myth. There was no rest for the wicked, just varying degrees of cold, damp, and fear. As you lie in your bed tonight, listening to the quiet hum of your house, think about that man on the rimrock. He's listening to the wind, wondering if that rustle in the grass is a rabbit or a deputy marshal with a warrant. He's adjusting his heavy wool coat, trying to find a spot on the hard earth that doesn't hurt his ribs, and waiting for a sun that he might not want to see. It was a life of shadows, where the only thing heavier than the quilts was the price on your head. And as the moon dipped behind the mountains, the only peace they found was the kind that comes from sheer, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that finally forces the eyes shut, even when you know they should stay open.
The Ghost in the Soddy and the Victorian Dream Book. So we've made it through the mud, the bugs, and the outlaws. But as the kerosene lamp flickered out in a lonely cabin on the edge of the Nebraska plains, a different kind of darkness set in. For the 19th century mind, the world wasn't just a collection of dirt and grass. It was a place thick with spirits, omens, and the lingering presence of the dead. When a pioneer closed their eyes in the Wild West, they weren't just sleeping. They were navigating a landscape of Victorian superstitions that would make a modern skeptic's head spin. To understand the sleep of a pioneer, you have to understand their relationship with death. In the 1870s, death was a frequent, uninvited house guest. It wasn't tucked away in hospitals. It happened in the bed you slept in. If a child died of scarlet fever or a grandfather passed away from the ague, their body would often remain in the house for a day or two before burial. People would sleep in the same room, sometimes even the same bed, where a loved one had recently drawn their last breath. This led to a very specific kind of nighttime anxiety. There was a widespread Victorian belief that the spirits of the dead lingered near their earthly homes, especially if they had died unrestfully. If you were sleeping in a sod house built on a lonely stretch of prairie, and the wind began to whistle through a crack in the mud walls, you didn't just think, "Oh, that's a draft." You thought it was the voice of a lost traveler or a departed relative trying to tell you something. To cope with this, people turned to dream books. These were cheap, mass-produced pamphlets that were almost as common as the Bible in frontier homes. They were alphabetical guides to the true meaning of your dreams. If you dreamed of a black dog, it meant a betrayal was coming. If you dreamed of falling water, it meant a harvest would fail. People would wake up in the middle of the night, light a precious candle, and flip through these books to see if their subconscious was warning them about a Cheyenne raid or a coming drought.
It was the 19th century version of checking your horoscopes, but with much higher stakes. And then there were the sleep protectors. Because the frontier was so isolated, people developed strange ritualistic habits to keep evil away while they were vulnerable in slumber. Some would place a pair of open scissors under their pillow to cut the bad dreams. Others would lean a broom against the inside of the door, believing that a witch or a spirit would be forced to count every single bristle on the broom before they could enter the room, a task that would luckily take until sunrise. You'd also see spirit boards or primitive Ouija boards in some of the more sophisticated mining towns. Spiritualism was a massive craze in the 1870s and 80s. People truly believed they could talk to the dead. Imagine being a lonely widow in a silver camp, spending your nights in a drafty room, trying to use a moving wooden pointer to ask your late husband where he'd buried the claim papers. It wasn't spooky to them. It was a desperate form of communication. It made sleep a very busy, very crowded experience. Let's float over to the night terrors of the prairie. There's a documented phenomenon called prairie madness. It was a type of psychological breakdown that affected many settlers, particularly women, who were often left alone in silent, isolated cabins for weeks at a time while the men were away. The silence of the plains could be deafening. At night, this madness manifested as spectral sightings. A woman might wake up and see a shadow man standing in the corner of the soddy, or she'd hear the sound of a phantom wagon pulling up to the house, only to find the yard empty under the moonlight. These weren't necessarily ghosts, they were the brain's reaction to extreme sensory deprivation. When the world is too quiet and too empty, the mind starts to fill in the blanks. They'd spend the night in a state of frozen watchfulness, clutching a Bible or a heavy iron poker, waiting for a ghost that was actually just the sound of the earth settling. Even the architecture of sleep was influenced by these fears. Have you ever noticed how high Victorian beds are? Many people believed that bad air or miasma, which they thought carried disease, hovered near the floor. By sleeping on a high bed with a thick mattress, you were literally trying to rise above the sickness. Of course, this also meant that if you fell out of bed in the middle of a nightmare, you were going to have a very long, very painful trip to the floorboards. For the indigenous peoples of the West, sleep and dreams were even more significant, but in a much more integrated way. While the white settlers feared their dreams, the tribes like the Lakota or the Nez Perce viewed dreams as a vital source of guidance. A vision quest was essentially a ritualized form of sleep deprivation and dreaming used to find one's purpose. They didn't see the night as a time of shutting down, but as a time of opening up to the spirit world. There's a tragic irony here. The pioneers were terrified of the spirits of the land they were trying to conquer, while the people who had lived there for millennia were at peace with them. The pioneers slept with Bibles and brooms to keep the night out. The indigenous people slept with the understanding that the night was just another part of the circle. As the 1890s approached and the wild part of the West began to fade, these superstitions started to change. The arrival of the railroad and the telegraph brought the rational world into the wilderness. The ghost in the soddy was slowly replaced by the anxiety of the mortgage. But on those nights when the wind really howled, when the snow was piled high, and the coyotes were singing their mournful, jagged songs, the old fears would come creeping back. You'd pull the heavy, scratchy quilt over your head, tuck your cold feet against the warm brick, and whisper a prayer. You weren't just praying for protection from the cold. You were praying that the shadow in the corner was just a shadow, and that the long winter wouldn't follow you into your dreams. The spiritual frontier was a place where the line between awake and asleep was thin and frayed. It was a world where a dream wasn't just a dream, it was a letter from the beyond, a warning from the earth, or a mirror reflecting your own deepest, darkest loneliness. And as you drift toward your own sleep tonight, maybe listen to the house for a moment. Every creak, every groan of the wood, every sigh of the wind. In 1880, those were the voices of a world that refused to be forgotten.